Hannah Brooks had exactly 4 minutes to pack 3 years of her life into one cardboard box. She didn't cry, she didn't argue, she simply nodded when Dr. Daniel Mercer, the hospital director, told her in front of the entire nursing staff that she was no longer welcome at St. Augustine Medical Center. A patient could have died because of this delay, Dr. Mercer said, his voice loud enough to carry down the corridor. We cannot have carelessness like this on my watch. Hannah said nothing. The truth was simple and painful. The medication delay wasn't her fault. It belonged to Dr. Reynolds, a senior physician with 20 years of seniority and a reputation the hospital board adored. He had misread a chart. He had delayed an order. And when the mistake surfaced, he had looked Hannah dead in the eye and said, "You'll handle this, won't you? You're better at smoothing things over than I am." It wasn't a request. It was an instruction disguised as flattery. Hannah could have corrected him. She could have pulled up the time-stamped records and shown everyone exactly whose signature was missing. But 3 feet away stood Priya, a 24-year-old junior nurse who had transcribed the order exactly as Dr. Reynolds dictated it, shaking, pale, silently mouthing "I'm sorry," over and over. If Hannah spoke the truth, Priya's career would end before it began. Hannah's own career, meanwhile, had already survived worse days than this one, so she stayed quiet. She let the blame land on her, the way rain lands on whoever happens to be standing outside. Whispers followed her down the hallway as she walked out with her box. Overweight, slow. Should have retired to a desk job years ago. She had heard versions of these comments for years, tucked into performance reviews and thrown across nursing stations, like darts nobody bothered removing from the board. Today, they followed her out the front doors like a parade she never asked to lead. She didn't look back. By the time Hannah reached her small rented house on Cedar Lane, the late afternoon sun was slipping behind the rooftops, and her hands were still shaking, not from anger, but from the strange, hollow quiet that comes after losing something you'd built for years. She had barely set her box down on the kitchen table when she heard it. Engines. Not one, several. She looked out her window and her stomach dropped. 5 black SUVs, windows tinted, moved down her narrow residential street in perfect formation, like a funeral procession for someone very important or very dangerous. Cedar Lane was the kind of street where the loudest sound most evenings was a barking dog or a lawnmower. It had never seen vehicles like this. Curtains twitched up and down the block. Mrs. Alvarez next door stepped onto her porch, phone already lifted, recording. Someone said to their kids to get inside. A man 3 houses down muttered the word everyone was thinking, Mafia. Hannah's mind raced through everything she could have possibly done wrong. She hadn't gambled, hadn't owed anyone money, hadn't crossed a single dangerous person in her life. She was a nurse who worked double shifts and fell asleep watching reruns. This didn't make sense. The SUVs stopped directly in front of her house. Doors opened in unison. Men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the street with the practiced calm of people used to being watched. Then, from the middle vehicle, a man stepped out alone. He was around 30, sharply dressed, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Hannah didn't recognize his face, but something about the way the entire street seemed to hold its breath told her exactly who, or what, he was. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a bouquet of white lilies, and in his other hand, a small, worn photograph. Hannah's front door was still open from when she'd rushed in, box in her arms. She stood frozen behind it, unsure whether to shut it or step outside. The man walked up her short driveway alone, his security fanning out behind him at a respectful distance, and stopped just a few feet from her porch steps. He held up the photograph so she could see it. It was faded, slightly creased at one corner, clearly carried in a wallet or a jacket pocket for a very long time. It showed a much younger Hannah, in nursing scrubs, laughing beside a thin, pale young woman with dark curly hair, both of them sitting on a hospital bed, covered in birthday decorations made from paper and tape. Hannah's breath caught. She hadn't seen that photo in 3 years. She hadn't thought about that patient in months, though the memory had never fully left her. The girl who fought so hard just to sit upright, who once told her, laughing through pain, that Hannah made hospitals feel less like prisons. The man's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, careful, almost hesitant, as if he had rehearsed this moment many times and still wasn't sure he'd get it right. "Miss Brooks," he said, "do you remember my sister, Isabella?" Hannah opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out, because somewhere behind the fear, behind the confusion, behind the humiliation of the day she'd just survived, one question was suddenly louder than all the rest. Why would a man like this have spent 3 years carrying her photograph like it mattered? 3 years earlier, the emergency doors of St. Augustine Medical Center burst open at 2 a.m., and a stretcher rushed through, carrying a 24-year-old woman who could barely keep her eyes open. Her name was Isabella Moretti. She had collapsed outside a university library, her body finally giving in to a severe autoimmune condition that had been quietly attacking her joints and organs for months. By the time she reached the hospital, she could barely lift her own arm. Beside the stretcher walked a young man, trying very hard to look like an ordinary, worried brother. He wore a plain jacket, kept his head down, and avoided eye contact with the security cameras mounted near the entrance. His name was Luca Moretti, and at 27, he had only recently begun stepping into leadership of his family's business. A business built on power, fear, and a reputation he was still learning to carry. He had one instruction for the admitting staff, repeated firmly but quietly: no names, no press, no questions. Word still spread through the hospital within hours, not because anyone confirmed anything, but because 5 armed men stationed themselves outside a hospital room, usually only assigned to minor cases. Nurses whispered theories in the break room. Some staff treated Isabella like a fragile celebrity, tiptoeing around her, laughing too hard at things she said, clearly trying to win favor with whoever was paying her medical bills. Hannah didn't do any of that. On her first night assigned to Isabella's care, Hannah walked in, checked her vitals, and asked the same question she asked every patient. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the pain right now? And don't lie to make me feel better. Isabella, surprised, actually laughed. 7, she admitted. Maybe 8, but I didn't want to be dramatic. You're allowed to be dramatic, Hannah said, adjusting her IV line. You're sick, not auditioning for a play. It was a small joke, but it was the first time in days Isabella had been treated like a person instead of a problem, to be managed carefully. Over the following weeks, that small moment grew into something much bigger. Hannah stayed late after her shifts ended, sitting beside Isabella during the worst of her treatments, when the medication made her shiver uncontrollably and the pain made sleep impossible. She didn't fill the silence with empty comfort. She simply stayed, sometimes talking, sometimes just present, letting Isabella know she wasn't suffering alone. When Isabella grew anxious about falling behind in her online university courses, Hannah brought in a small lap desk from a supply closet and helped prop her up so she could attend virtual lectures between treatments. When Isabella cried out of frustration because her legs felt too weak to hold her, Hannah walked beside her one careful step at a time down the hallway, again and again, refusing to let her give up on the days she wanted to. And when Isabella's birthday arrived quietly, with no visitors allowed due to hospital restrictions and her family unable to travel safely without drawing attention, Hannah showed up at the end of her shift, holding a single cupcake with a bent candle stuck crookedly in the frosting. "It's not much," Hannah admitted, setting it carefully on the bedside tray. Isabella stared at it like it was the most important gift she had ever received. Her eyes filled with tears, she quickly tried to blink away. "Nobody remembered," she whispered. "I remembered," Hannah said simply. "Make a wish." Isabella closed her eyes, made her wish, and blew out the candle with the small breath she could manage. Later that night, when Hannah was adjusting her blankets before leaving, Isabella grabbed her hand. "You know," she said quietly, "I have brothers, cousins, an army of people who work for my family. But you're the only person who's made me feel like I still have a future. You're the sister I never had." Hannah smiled but brushed it off gently, the way she brushed off most compliments. "You're going to walk out of here and forget all about hospital food and grumpy nurses." "I won't forget," Isabella said. "I promise." Weeks later, Isabella was discharged, stronger, steadier, and finally able to walk unassisted to the car waiting outside. She hugged Hannah tightly at the door, promising to visit, promising to stay in touch, promising this wasn't goodbye. Life, however, rarely keeps promises simple. Not long after, Hannah transferred hospitals to be closer to her ailing mother, and in the chaos of paperwork, new schedules, and old contact numbers no longer working, the connection between the two women quietly slipped away. Isabella tried reaching out once, months later, only to find the number disconnected. She searched for Hannah's name at the old hospital, but records were sealed, and staff had no forwarding information to share. For 3 years, Isabella carried the memory of a nurse who once treated her like family, wondering every single day whether she would ever get the chance to say thank you. She had no idea that fate was about to answer that question in the most unexpected way possible. On the very same day, the woman she never forgot had just lost everything. Hannah's hand found the doorframe, steadying herself as she finally managed to speak. "Isabella," she whispered. She's your sister?" Luca nodded, a small, almost boyish relief crossing his face, as if he'd been holding his breath since he stepped out of the car. "She never stopped talking about you, even after 3 years. Hannah's mind was still spinning. First the firing, now this. "I don't understand. How did you even find me? How did you know where I lived? How did you know—" Her voice trailed off as a colder thought settled in. "How did you know I got fired today?" Luca's expression flickered, just for a second, with something like guilt. "A former volunteer from St. Augustine still keeps in touch with our family," he admitted. "She recognized your name on a chat, saw people talking about what happened in the hallway this afternoon, and mentioned it to Isabella almost immediately. Isabella called me within the hour." Hannah blinked. "Within the hour?" "She was furious," Luca said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Angrier than I've seen her in a long time. She kept saying, 'They fired the one person who never treated me like I was broken.' She wanted to come herself. But she has final exams tomorrow, and I convinced her that showing up with an entire convoy might not be the best way to introduce herself back into your life." Hannah let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, though her heart was still pounding. "So this isn't—" She gestured weakly at the 5 SUVs still parked along her quiet street, neighbors watching from behind curtains. "This isn't some kind of threat?" Luca finished for her, almost amused. "No, Miss Brooks. I promise you, nobody here means you any harm." "Then why do you need 5 cars, and men who look like they could take down a building?" Luca sighed, glancing briefly at his security team standing at a respectful distance. Unfortunately, that part isn't optional. My position makes me a target for certain people. Rivals, informants, people who'd like nothing more than to use someone I care about against me. I can't travel without protection, even for something as simple as thanking a nurse. I wish it were different. Hannah studied him carefully. Nothing about him matched the frightening image she'd built in her head in those first panicked seconds. No cruelty in his eyes, no menace in his posture. Just a tired, sincere man, holding flowers a little too tightly, as if nervous she might refuse them. "I'm sorry about earlier," Hannah said quietly. "I thought, well, you can imagine what I thought." "I'd have thought the same thing," Luca said. 5 black SUVs, pulling onto a residential street, rarely means good news. A short, surprised laugh escaped her, the first genuine one all day. It felt strange, laughing after everything that had happened that afternoon, being humiliated in front of colleagues, packing years of her life into a single box, and now standing on her porch, talking to a man capable of turning entire neighborhoods silent with fear. Luca stepped forward and finally offered her the bouquet of white lilies. "Isabella wanted you to know she's graduating in a few weeks. She refused to celebrate until she found a way to properly thank you." Hannah took the flowers, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed her face gently toward the petals, buying herself a moment to collect the emotions rising in her chest. "She didn't have to do all this," she murmured. "I was just doing my job." "You did more than your job," Luca said, his voice suddenly serious. "You gave my sister her life back when doctors were only treating her illness, not her. That's not something my family forgets." Hannah shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his gratitude, unused to being thanked so directly, so completely. She wasn't used to being seen at all, not after years of being overlooked, judged for her weight, dismissed as replaceable. Before he turned to leave, Luca paused, choosing his next words carefully. "If you ever need anything, protection, resources, connections, anything at all, please understand that my family owes you a debt we can't fully repay. All you'd have to do is ask." Hannah shook her head immediately, politely but firmly. "I appreciate it, truly, but I don't need anything from you, Mr. Moretti. I did what I did because it was right, not because I expected something in return." Something in Luca's eyes shifted. Respect, perhaps, or quiet surprise. Most people who learned who he was reacted very differently. Fear, flattery, or thinly disguised requests for favors. Hannah simply stood on her porch, holding flowers, refusing anything more than gratitude already given. "Very well," Luca said, stepping back toward his car. "But the offer stands. Always." The convoy pulled away as quickly as it had arrived, leaving Cedar Lane in stunned, curious silence. Neighbors slowly emerged from behind their curtains, whispering, already reshaping the story into something far more dramatic than the truth. Hannah stood on her porch a long while after the cars disappeared, flowers in her arms, the photograph Luca had left behind still resting gently on her palm. She had no idea that while she stood there in quiet relief, back at St. Augustine Medical Center, the truth about why she was really fired was already beginning to unravel, far faster and far louder than anyone had expected. By the time Hannah's first quiet evening at home ended, St. Augustine Medical Center was already starting to feel the absence of the woman it had dismissed only hours earlier. The night shift began, and within the first hour, 3 separate patients asked for Nurse Brooks by name. "She said she'd check on my mother again tonight," one elderly man insisted, confused when a new nurse introduced herself instead. "Where did she go?" A nurse named Priya, the same young woman whose mistake had cost Hannah her job, stood frozen at the nurse's station when she heard the question repeated for the 3rd time that night. Her hands trembled slightly as she pretended to organize files, avoiding the eyes of her coworkers. She hadn't slept the night before. She could still hear Dr. Mercer's voice echoing down the hallway, still see Hannah's calm, unreadable expression as she accepted blame for something she never did. Priya had wanted to speak up in that moment, had opened her mouth more than once, but the words had lodged in her throat, frozen by fear of losing the career she'd worked so hard for. Now, watching the chaos of a hospital missing its steadiest hands, guilt sat heavier in her chest with every passing hour. By the second night, the cracks were harder to ignore. Junior nurses, who had once relied on Hannah's quiet guidance during difficult procedures, fumbled through tasks they normally handled with confidence. A medication schedule was briefly miscommunicated between shifts. Nothing dangerous, but enough to remind everyone how much invisible order Hannah had kept running smoothly behind the scenes. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, something else was building. A former patient, unaware of the incident entirely, posted a heartfelt review online thanking Nurse Hannah Brooks for staying by her bedside through a difficult diagnosis months earlier. Within a day, other patients began commenting beneath it, sharing similar memories, stories of small kindnesses, patient explanations, quiet reassurance during frightening moments. Nobody connected it to her firing yet, not at first, but by the third day, one comment changed everything. A young nurse's cousin, who worked as an orderly at St. Augustine, mentioned online that the sweet nurse everyone's talking about got fired yesterday for something that wasn't even her fault. The comment spread quickly, reposted and screenshotted across local community groups, gaining momentum with every share. Whispers inside the hospital grew louder too. By the fourth day, Priya could no longer bear the weight of her silence. During a quiet moment in the break room, surrounded by a small group of colleagues discussing the unusual online buzz, she finally broke. It wasn't her mistake, Priya said, her voice shaking. It was Dr. Reynolds. He misread the chart. I transcribed exactly what he told me, and when it went wrong, he asked Hannah to handle it. She took the blame to protect me. The room fell silent. She knew, Priya continued, tears slipping down her face, and she never said a word. Not one word to save herself. The story spread through the hospital in a single afternoon, moving from department to department like fire finding dry wood. Nurses who had worked alongside Hannah for years weren't surprised. It matched everything they already knew about her character. What shocked them was Dr. Reynolds' silence, and worse, Dr. Mercer's refusal to reconsider his hasty decision even after the truth surfaced. By the fifth day, 2 senior board members quietly requested a meeting with Dr. Mercer, concerned about growing morale issues and a noticeable rise in nurse resignation inquiries. Dr. Mercer, however, remained stubbornly defensive. I made the decision I believed was necessary at the time, he told them firmly. We cannot appear weak by reversing personnel decisions based on rumors and online gossip. This isn't gossip, one board member replied carefully. Multiple witnesses have confirmed the same story. She never once corrected the record herself, Dr. Mercer argued. If she truly wasn't responsible, why stay silent? Nobody in the room had a comfortable answer to that question, except, perhaps, the quiet, uncomfortable truth that loyalty, dignity, and protecting others rarely make headlines the way blame and scandal do. Meanwhile, patient satisfaction surveys due at the end of the month began trickling in early, several containing unprompted comments, specifically naming Hannah Brooks as the reason for their positive experience. The hospital's marketing department, unaware of the internal controversy, initially considered using some of the glowing reviews for a promotional campaign, until someone quietly pointed out the obvious problem. By the end of the first week, St. Augustine Medical Center found itself facing a crisis it never anticipated. The sudden, painfully public realization that the person they had discarded so easily was the very reason so many patients and staff trusted the hospital in the first place. Dr. Mercer still refused to publicly admit fault, but behind closed doors, murmurs of concern grew louder. Board members exchanged uneasy glances during meetings, and for the first time since taking his position, Dr. Mercer began to feel the ground shifting beneath him. He had no idea that the storm building around him was about to grow far louder, because 300 miles away, at a university graduation ceremony nobody at the hospital had been invited to, a young woman named Isabella Moretti was preparing to stand in front of hundreds of people and say Hannah's name out loud for the entire world to hear. The university auditorium was packed, sunlight streaming through tall windows onto rows of proud families holding phones and flowers, waiting for names to be called. Isabella Moretti sat near the front of the graduating class, her cap slightly crooked, her heart pounding harder than it ever had during any hospital treatment. She had been asked, weeks earlier, to give a short speech representing students who had overcome serious personal challenges during their studies. At the time, she'd almost declined. Talking about her illness publicly had never appealed to her. She preferred moving forward, not reliving the frightened, fragile version of herself she used to be. But after learning what happened to Hannah, everything changed. She hadn't slept properly since the call from the hospital volunteer. She kept replaying memories from 3 years earlier, the cupcake with the crooked candle, the quiet late-night conversations, the patient hand guiding her down hospital hallways, one shaking step at a time. And now, the woman responsible for those memories had been publicly humiliated and fired for a mistake that wasn't even hers. Isabella decided, quietly and firmly, that if she was given a microphone in front of hundreds of people, she wasn't going to waste it, talking only about herself. When her name was called to speak, she walked to the podium with more composure than she felt. She glanced briefly toward the section where her brother sat. Luca, dressed plainly, doing his best to blend into a crowd of proud parents, though the quiet presence of 2 security personnel near the exits made that a little difficult. Isabella cleared her throat and began. 3 years ago, she said, her voice steady, despite the nerves, I collapsed in a library not far from here. I spent the following weeks in a hospital bed, watching my body fail me in ways I didn't understand, wondering if I'd ever walk normally again, wondering if I'd ever finish the degree I'm receiving today. The auditorium quieted, hundreds of eyes fixed on her. Doctors treated my illness, she continued, but one nurse treated me. She didn't see a diagnosis or a difficult case. She saw a scared 24-year-old who needed someone to believe she still had a future worth fighting for. Isabella's voice wavered slightly, but she pushed forward. She stayed after her shifts ended, just to sit with me during the hardest nights. She helped me keep up with my classes when I thought I'd have to give up everything I'd worked for. She walked beside me, one small step at a time, when I couldn't imagine ever walking on my own again. And on a birthday when no one could visit me, she brought me a cupcake with a candle stuck in crooked frosting, and she made sure I knew I wasn't forgotten. A few soft gasps and quiet sniffles rippled through the crowd. I recently learned, Isabella said, her tone shifting, steady but pointed now, that this same nurse, one of the kindest, most dedicated people I have ever known, was publicly fired last week for a mistake that wasn't hers. She stayed silent to protect a young colleague, and instead of being thanked for her selflessness, she was humiliated in front of the very people she had spent years caring for. She paused, letting the words settle. I don't know what happens to her next, but I know this. Somewhere out there is a nurse named Hannah Brooks, who gave me my life back when I had no reason to believe I still had one. And today, on the day I finally get to celebrate everything she helped make possible, I wanted the world to know her name. The applause that followed wasn't polite or ceremonial. It was loud, immediate, filled with genuine emotion. Several parents wiped their eyes. Someone near the back began recording on their phone, capturing every word. By that evening, a shaky video clip of Isabella's speech had been uploaded online. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by captions expressing outrage, admiration, and disbelief that a hospital would fire someone described in such glowing terms. Former patients who had crossed paths with Hannah over the years began adding their own stories beneath the video. Memories of sitting with frightened family members, of late-night reassurances during frightening diagnoses, of a nurse who always seemed to remember small details that made unbearable situations feel slightly less terrifying. Local news outlets picked up the story within 2 days, running segments titled things like "The Nurse They Fired" and "The Family That Refused to Let Her Story End There." Reporters called St. Augustine Medical Center requesting comment. Dr. Mercer's assistant fielded call after call, each one harder to dismiss than the last. Public opinion, once shaped by hospital gossip and vague rumors, shifted rapidly and decisively. Hannah Brooks was no longer remembered as the nurse who caused a delay. She had become, almost overnight, a symbol of quiet dignity in a system that too often overlooked it. Hannah herself learned about the speech from a shaky phone video sent by a former coworker, watching alone in her kitchen, with trembling hands and tears she couldn't quite explain. She hadn't expected gratitude. She certainly hadn't expected the entire internet to know her name within 48 hours. But even as messages of support flooded in, Hannah felt an unfamiliar unease settle beneath the warmth. Attention, she had learned long ago, rarely stayed simple, and somewhere across the city, inside a hospital boardroom growing more anxious by the hour, Dr. Mercer was about to discover that ignoring a viral moment was no longer an option he could afford. 2 weeks after Isabella's speech spread across the internet, Hannah sat in a small, sunlit office belonging to the Moretti Family Community Health Foundation, staring at a folder she wasn't sure she was ready to open. The foundation, unlike the family's more shadowed reputation, was entirely legitimate, funding mobile medical clinics for underserved neighborhoods, organizing free health camps in rural areas, and training healthcare workers in regions where hospitals were scarce and resources scarcer. Luca had mentioned it briefly the evening he visited her home, though Hannah hadn't expected to hear from him again so soon. "We'd like to offer you a leadership position," said Marguerite Chen, the foundation's soft-spoken but sharp-eyed director, sliding the folder across the desk. "You'd design and lead our nurse training programs, mentorship structures, clinical guidelines, hands-on workshops for newly graduated nurses entering high-need areas." Hannah opened the folder slowly, scanning the proposed salary, the responsibilities, the vision statement filled with words like dignity, equity, and sustainable care. It was, on paper, everything she had quietly wished existed somewhere in the healthcare system she'd devoted her career to. "This is generous," Hannah said carefully. "But I need to be honest with you. Accepting this might mean I can never really go back to hospital work." "Not after everything that's happened." Marguerite nodded, unsurprised. "That's a fair concern. But may I ask you something? When you think about going back to a hospital like St. Augustine, does it feel like relief, or does it feel like defeat?" Hannah didn't answer right away. The truth sat heavier in her chest than she expected. That night, at her parents' modest house across town, Hannah sat at the kitchen table, picking at dinner she barely tasted, turning the question over and over. "You've been quiet all evening," her mother said, setting down her fork. "Something's on your mind." Hannah explained the offer, laying out every detail: the salary, the mission, the uncertainty of leaving hospital nursing behind entirely after building an entire identity around it. Her father, a retired construction worker with little patience for corporate double talk, listened carefully before speaking. "Hannah, sweetheart, you've spent 15 years proving your worth to people who only saw your body before they saw your skill. You've been passed over for promotions, criticized for your weight in performance reviews that had nothing to do with your weight, and then blamed for someone else's mistake. And you're worried about leaving that behind?" Hannah managed a small, tired smile. "It's not that simple, Dad." "No," her mother agreed gently, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "But maybe it's simpler than you think. Choose the place that respects you, sweetheart, not the one that merely pays you." Meanwhile, back at St. Augustine Medical Center, the fallout from Isabella's viral speech had only intensified. Dr. Mercer found himself fielding uncomfortable questions from reporters, anxious calls from hospital board members, and, more troubling still, private conversations with talented staff members, quietly inquiring about the Moretti Foundation's new training initiative. Word had spread quickly that Hannah Brooks might be joining a competing healthcare program, and several nurses, including two of St. Augustine's most promising junior staff, began wondering aloud whether the same opportunity might exist for them. "We're losing people," warned Dr. Sandra Whitfield, one of the hospital's longest-serving board members, during a tense afternoon meeting. 3 resignations this month alone, all mentioning burnout, lack of support, or, directly or indirectly, Hannah Brooks. Dr. Mercer rubbed his temples, visibly exhausted. "This is an overreaction. One viral video does not undo years of institutional reputation. With respect, Daniel," Dr. Whitfield said carefully, "it's not just the video. The board has requested an internal review of the incident that led to her termination. Preliminary findings suggest Dr. Reynolds was, in fact, responsible for the original chart error." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. He had built his career on decisive, unquestionable authority. Admitting fault, publicly felt, to him, indistinguishable from weakness. "I made the decision I believed the situation demanded," he repeated. The same defense he'd offered for days. "Perhaps," Dr. Whitfield replied quietly, "but decisions have consequences, and right now, this hospital is paying for one it didn't fully understand." Back at her parents' kitchen table, Hannah made her decision the following morning, not with dramatic certainty, but with the quiet clarity that often follows a sleepless night of honest thinking. She called Marguerite Chen before breakfast. "I have some conditions," Hannah said. "I want full control over how the training program is structured. I want it accessible to nurses, regardless of where they graduated from, not just prestigious universities. And I want at least a portion of the program dedicated specifically to mentoring nurses who've been overlooked or underestimated. For any reason at all." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by something that sounded distinctly like relief. "Done," Marguerite said. "When can you start?" Hannah exhaled slowly, feeling something unfamiliar settle into place. Not triumph exactly, but something close to it. Purpose, perhaps, finally aligning with possibility. She had no way of knowing that her decision would arrive at the worst possible moment for St. Augustine Medical Center, because within days, the board would summon Dr. Mercer for a meeting neither of them expected to end the way it eventually did. Forcing him to make an offer Hannah never imagined she'd have the chance to refuse. The boardroom at St. Augustine Medical Center felt smaller than usual, though nothing about its size had actually changed. 12 members sat around the long table, folders open, expressions tense. At the head of it, Dr. Daniel Mercer straightened his tie, for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, rehearsing words he didn't fully believe. Hannah sat near the far end, invited back for the first time since her termination. Not as an employee, but as a guest, the board had specifically requested to hear from directly. She hadn't wanted to come. Marguerite had encouraged her gently, reminding her that closure sometimes mattered, even when it wasn't required. Her parents had encouraged her differently, reminding her she owed nobody an explanation, least of all the man who fired her without asking a single question first. In the end, Hannah came because she wanted to see this through with her own eyes, not through hospital rumors or viral videos. Dr. Mercer cleared his throat, addressing her directly for the first time in weeks. "Miss Brooks, thank you for coming. As you're likely aware, the board has completed its internal review of the incident, leading to your termination." Hannah said nothing, waiting. "The review confirms," Dr. Mercer continued, each word visibly costing him something, "that the medication delay was the result of an oversight by Dr. Reynolds, not any failure on your part." A few board members shifted in their seats. Dr. Whitfield gave Hannah a small, encouraging nod from across the table. "In light of this," Dr. Mercer said, "the board and I would like to offer you your position back, effective immediately, along with a formal apology and—" He paused briefly, as though the next words physically pained him. "Back pay for the time missed." It was, on paper, everything Hannah could have demanded weeks earlier. And yet, sitting there, listening to the careful, rehearsed cadence of his voice, Hannah understood immediately what this moment actually was. It wasn't remorse, it was damage control. "May I ask something first?" Hannah said calmly. Dr. Mercer nodded, visibly relieved to have the floor shift away from him, even briefly. "If Isabella Moretti hadn't given that speech," Hannah asked, "if her story hadn't gone viral, if the hospital hadn't started losing staff and facing public criticism, would this offer exist today?" The room went quiet. Dr. Mercer opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. "I think we all know the answer," Hannah said, not unkindly, simply honestly. "This isn't about righting a wrong. It's about calming public backlash and stopping more resignations." "That's not entirely fair," Dr. Mercer said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Maybe not entirely," Hannah agreed. "But it's not entirely wrong either." She let the silence settle before continuing, choosing her next words carefully, not out of anger, but out of a clarity she hadn't fully possessed the day she was fired. "I appreciate the apology," she said. "I do, but I won't be returning to St. Augustine." Murmurs rippled quietly around the table. Dr. Mercer's expression flickered with something between surprise and quiet panic. "Before I go," Hannah continued, "I do want to say something. Not for my sake, but for the nurses still working here." She glanced briefly at the folder in front of her, though she didn't need notes for what came next. "Nurses deserve fair, thorough investigations before blame is assigned, not decisions made in 5 minutes based on assumptions. Senior staff should be held to the same standards as junior staff, not shielded by seniority or reputation. And a person's appearance, weight, age, or background should never factor into judgments about their professional competence." She looked directly at Dr. Mercer as she said the last part, and though he said nothing, something in his expression suggested the words landed exactly where she intended them to. "I say this not out of bitterness," Hannah added, softer now, "but because I think this hospital is capable of doing better. It already has good people in it. It simply needs leadership willing to protect them properly." Dr. Whitfield spoke up gently from across the table. "Miss Brooks, is there anything the board could offer that might change your decision?" Hannah shook her head, not unkindly. "I've already accepted a position with the Moretti Foundation. I believe I can help more nurses there than I ever could returning to a place that only remembered my value once it became publicly inconvenient to ignore it." The meeting ended shortly after, Dr. Mercer offering a stiff handshake that Hannah accepted politely, though both understood it carried little real warmth. As Hannah gathered her things to leave, several board members lingered, quietly approaching her. not to convince her to stay, but simply to thank her. Some visibly moved, others clearly uncomfortable with how plainly her words had exposed problems they'd long chosen to overlook. Dr. Whitfield walked her to the elevator, speaking quietly. "For what it's worth, Miss Brooks, several of us intend to push for broader changes here. Accountability policies, fairer investigation procedures. Your situation exposed things this hospital needed to confront." Hannah offered a small, genuine smile. "I hope it helps someone else avoid what happened to me." As the elevator doors closed, Hannah felt something settle quietly inside her chest. Not quite triumph, not quite relief, but something steadier than either. A sense that she had finally chosen her own worth over someone else's convenience. She had no idea, stepping out into the parking lot moments later, that the most difficult part of Dr. Mercer's reckoning had barely begun. Because within days, quiet conversations among board members would grow into something far more permanent, reshaping the hospital's leadership entirely, long after Hannah Brooks had already walked away for good. The first mobile clinic Hannah helped organize for the Moretti Foundation set up in a small rural community 2 hours outside the city, in a region where the nearest hospital was over an hour's drive away. She arrived before sunrise, helping unload folding tables, medical supplies, and equipment from the back of a truck, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, looking nothing like someone who'd spent weeks at the center of a viral news story. By mid-morning, a line of over 60 people stretched down the dirt road, mothers with young children, elderly men waiting patiently in the heat, farm workers taking rare time off to have themselves checked for the first time in years. Hannah moved between patients and the newly graduated nurses she was training, offering quiet corrections, patient explanations, and the same steady calm she'd once given a frightened young woman in a hospital bed 3 years earlier. "You're rushing," she told a nervous nurse named Elena, gently guiding her hand steadier over a blood draw. "Slow down. The patient can feel your nerves before they feel the needle." Elena exhaled, nodded, and tried again. This time, smoother, calmer, more confident. This was the work Hannah had quietly dreamed of doing for years, without ever fully admitting it to herself. Not simply treating patients, but shaping the next generation of caregivers into people who led with both skill and compassion. Luca visited the Foundation's projects occasionally, though far less often than Hannah expected given his family's initial involvement. True to his word, he rarely interfered with her work directly, choosing instead to support quietly from a distance, approving budgets, ensuring supply shipments arrived on schedule, occasionally showing up unannounced, simply to observe. "You could sit in an office and just sign checks," Hannah told him one afternoon, catching him helping stack folding chairs after a health camp had wrapped up for the day. "You don't have to carry boxes." "I don't mind," Luca said, adjusting his sleeves. "Besides, Isabella would never forgive me if she found out I sat comfortably in an air-conditioned office while you worked in the heat." Hannah laughed, surprising herself with how easily it came now, compared to the guarded tension of their very first conversation on her porch months earlier. Over time, without either of them fully planning it, their relationship had shifted from cautious gratitude into something steadier. Shared coffee after long site visits, quiet conversations about the Foundation's future, small moments of trust building slowly, brick by brick. Isabella, now fully recovered and working as a licensed physiotherapist, joined several of the Foundation's rural health camps as a volunteer, working directly alongside Hannah for the first time since her hospital discharge years earlier. "This feels strange," Isabella admitted one afternoon, watching Hannah instruct a group of young nurses on proper wound care technique. "Being on this side of things instead of the patient. Good strange or bad strange?" Hannah asked, smiling. "Good," Isabella said immediately. "Really good. Like something finally came full circle." Their bond, once built entirely around Isabella's illness, slowly transformed into genuine friendship, shared lunches during breaks, quiet laughter over inside jokes. Only nurses and patients who'd survived difficult months together could understand. An ease neither of them had expected, but both deeply appreciated. Not every part of building something new came without difficulty. Funding challenges occasionally threatened project timelines. A shipment of essential medical supplies was delayed for nearly 2 weeks due to bureaucratic red tape, forcing Hannah and her team to improvise with limited resources during an especially busy rural health camp. A newly hired program coordinator resigned unexpectedly midway through training season, leaving Hannah to juggle responsibilities meant for 2 people until a replacement could be found. Through it all, Hannah discovered a quiet strength she hadn't fully recognized in herself before. Not simply resilience in caring for patients, but resilience in building something lasting, something bigger than any single hospital shift or performance review had ever allowed her to prove. Word of the foundation's growing success slowly spread. Universities began reaching out, interested in partnering their nursing programs with Hannah's mentorship structure. Local news outlets, having once covered her firing as scandal, now returned to profile her work as inspiration. Headlines shifting from "the nurse they fired" to "the nurse rebuilding healthcare from the ground up." One evening, after a particularly long health camp wrapped up under a golden, fading sky, Hannah and Luca sat together on the open tailgate of the supply truck, sharing a simple dinner of sandwiches packed that morning. "You've changed something out here," Luca said quietly, watching the last few volunteers pack away equipment in the distance. "Not just for patients, for the nurses too. I've seen the way they look at you, like you've given them permission to believe they matter." Hannah considered his words carefully before answering. "Maybe that's all any of us really need. Someone willing to see us clearly, instead of just seeing what's convenient." Luca glanced at her, something unspoken passing quietly between them, respect deepening slowly into something warmer, something neither of them rushed to name aloud, but both quietly understood was growing steadily, day by day, choice by choice. Neither of them realized, sitting there in comfortable silence beneath a darkening sky, that the story building quietly between them was about to reach a moment neither had fully anticipated. Because in less than a year, the very neighborhood that once watched 5 black SUVs arrive in fear would soon witness them return for an entirely different reason. One destined to change not just Hannah's life, but the lives of thousands who would never have known her name at all, if not for a firing meant to break her. 1 year to the day after Hannah Brooks was publicly fired from St. Augustine Medical Center, a new building stood finished on a quiet stretch of land just outside the city. Clean brick walls, wide windows catching the morning light, and a simple sign above the entrance that read, "The Isabella Moretti Community Medical Center." Hannah stood near the entrance early that morning, running her hand lightly over the freshly painted doorframe, still adjusting to the reality that a place meant to serve thousands of patients now existed because of a firing meant to break her. The center had grown from a single idea, Hannah's insistence, months earlier, that the foundation's rural health camps needed a permanent home, somewhere patients could return to consistently instead of waiting for scheduled visits. What began as a modest proposal slowly expanded into a fully staffed nonprofit medical facility, offering affordable care, nurse training programs, and mentorship opportunities for young healthcare workers just beginning their careers. Above the main reception desk, in simple lettering, hung the center's guiding mission statement, chosen by Hannah herself. "Every patient deserves dignity. Every nurse deserves respect." By mid-morning, the street outside filled with people gathering for the opening ceremony. Former patients Hannah had cared for over the years, young nurses she had personally trained, longtime colleagues from her early nursing career, and community members who had come to know her simply through word of mouth and quiet reputation. Then, right on schedule, 5 black SUVs turned onto the street. A year earlier, their arrival had sent an entire neighborhood into panic. Curtains twitching nervously, whispered fears of violence and danger. Today, the crowd gathered outside the new medical center didn't flinch. Several people even smiled, recognizing exactly who was arriving and why. Luca stepped out first, dressed simply, without the tension that had marked his very first visit to Hannah's porch. Isabella followed closely behind, positively glowing, greeting familiar faces from the Foundation's health camps with warm hugs and easy laughter. "Feels different this time, doesn't it?" Luca said quietly, standing beside Hannah as the crowd continued gathering. "Completely different," Hannah agreed, smiling as she watched Isabella crouch down to greet a little girl clutching her mother's hand, one of many young patients the center's pediatric program would soon serve. Among the arriving guests, an unexpected face appeared near the back of the crowd. Dr. Daniel Mercer, dressed plainly, standing somewhat awkwardly at the edges of a celebration he clearly hadn't been sure he'd be welcome to attend. Much had changed for him over the past year. Following the board's extended internal review and mounting pressure from continued staff departures, Dr. Mercer had ultimately stepped down from his position as hospital director, replaced by new leadership committed to implementing many of the accountability changes Hannah had once outlined so plainly in that final boardroom meeting. He approached Hannah cautiously as the crowd began settling for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "I wasn't sure I should come." "I'm glad you did," Hannah said, and meant it. Dr. Mercer hesitated, visibly working up the courage for words he'd clearly rehearsed. "I owe you a genuine apology," he said finally. "Not the one I gave the board for the sake of public image, but a real one. I judged you unfairly, based on assumptions I never bothered questioning, about the situation, and if I'm honest with myself, about you personally. I let appearances influence decisions that should have been based entirely on character and truth. I'm sorry, Hannah, truly." Hannah studied him for a long moment, searching for hesitation or performance in his expression, finding instead something that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like genuine humility. "I accept your apology," she said simply, "but I won't be returning to St. Augustine, Daniel. Not because I'm still angry, but because I've found where I'm meant to be." Dr. Mercer nodded, unsurprised, offering a small, sincere smile. "I understand completely. For what it's worth, this place is remarkable. You built something the entire healthcare system should learn from." As the ceremony began, Marguerite Chen introduced Hannah to the gathered crowd, briefly recounting the Foundation's rapid growth over the past year, the rural health camps, the nurse mentorship programs, the countless patients now receiving care they might never have otherwise accessed. When it came time to cut the ribbon, Hannah insisted Isabella join her, scissors shared between them, as camera flashes captured the moment, cheers rising from the gathered crowd. Afterward, as guests began touring the new facility, Isabella pulled Hannah aside for a quiet moment beneath the shade of a newly planted tree near the entrance. "3 years ago," Isabella said softly, her eyes glistening, "you gave me hope when I had none left. You sat with me through the worst nights of my life and made me believe I still had a future worth fighting for." Hannah's throat tightened, emotion rising unexpectedly. "Today," Isabella continued, gesturing toward the crowd of patients, nurses, and volunteers filling the building behind them, "you've given that same hope to thousands of people who will never know exactly how it all started. But I know, and I'll never stop being grateful." The two women embraced tightly. 3 years of connection finally settling into the place it was always meant to reach. Later that evening, as the crowd slowly dispersed and the sun began sinking behind the newly finished building, Hannah stood quietly beside Luca, watching the last of the 5 SUVs prepare to leave. "No panic this time," Luca said, smiling faintly as he watched a few children wave goodbye to his security team like old friends. "No panic," Hannah agreed, "just gratitude." She thought back to the day everything began, the humiliation of being fired, the fear of 5 black SUVs pulling onto her quiet street, the uncertainty of what would come next. None of it had unfolded the way fear predicted. Instead, kindness once given quietly, without expectation of anything in return, had somehow returned tenfold, reshaping lives far beyond her own. The story of Hannah Brooks was never truly about revenge, or fear, or even redemption in the way most people imagined it. It was about compassion, quiet, patient, and unwavering, finally receiving the recognition it deserved, not through anger, but through the simple, powerful truth that kindness, however small it seems in the moment, has a way of returning exactly when the world least expects it.